Hello, today we will be talking about methods in psychology, so chapter 2, and we have split this chapter up into 3 sections, and so I will be talking about the different types of methodology in psychology and also begin to talk about our data and how it is organized. And so we will begin with what is empiricism and what does it actually look like. So with empiricism is the best way to understand and how to develop theories and to test them using sound methodology. And the scientific method which we test our empirically supported treatments or theories suggests that when we have an idea, we should gather empirical evidence to support or disprove it. And so with the scientific method, we have theories and we have hypotheses. And so with theories are, like I said, made up of hypotheses which are falsifiable. And something that is falsifiable does not mean that it is false, but rather it means that if it is false, then observation or an experiment will at some point demonstrate that it is false. And so theories attempt to explain why phenomena happen, but theories really are just those specific hypothetical guesses that are usually derived from a theory. And so when we test these theories and these hypotheses that we may have, we test them using this empirical scientific method, where we essentially gather lots of data and see what we find and whether it supports or disproves that theory or that hypothesis. And so the scientific method is it really just that easy. We gather data and we see if it's true or not. And when we look at the scientific method and using the method with psychology or psychological research, we have certain challenges to our methods. And what makes it so difficult is that if we think of all individuals, we are all complex. And one individual by themselves is complex in terms of their mind and their behavior, their emotions, and one individual alone is complex, but when you put them together with a whole sample of unique individuals bringing their own past, bringing their own minds or behaviors, then it makes it even more complex. And the next is variability. And variability is what we've, similar to what we talked about in the last section, is that with variability, no two individuals are alike. And so how do we actually describe all of these individuals that are included in our study and trying to describe these psychological constructs, whether that's happiness or whether we're looking at depression, anxiety, any of these traits? How do we actually look at them and come to some kind of conclusion about our research methods? The third one is reactivity. So people act differently in different situations, and we'll talk about this in the next slide. So people may act different when they're in the classroom versus when you're with your when you're out and about with your friends. Also, people act differently when someone is observing them versus not being observed. So what we want to do is observe what people what people do in order to help explain why people do what they do. So again, we want to observe what people do in order to help explain why they do the things they do. And so this is generally what people talk about when they are interested in psychology. You may have found yourself often wondering why people act the way they do. And so this is one of the driving forces behind psychological research. So why is that happening? Why is this phenomena going on? And so the different types of reactivity that I had mentioned earlier include social desirability. So participants within our study may respond in ways that make them look better or more socially acceptable. So questions like, do you wash your hands after using the bathroom? Or questions about racial stereotypes or sex stereotypes. These often lead people to respond in a way that is socially acceptable. So we hope that individuals that are asked if they wash their hands after the bathroom say yes. Sometimes when you're in that situation, you feel, whether you do or you don't, you want to be looked upon in a certain way. And so this is talking about that social desirability. And here we have a second type of reactivity called demand characteristics. And so this is where participants respond the way they think the researcher wants them to. So if I bring you into the lab and I want you to take a test, whether that's an intelligence test or just asking questions about your grade point average and the grades that you received last semester. Participants, oftentimes if it's something like that and I'm standing right over your shoulder looking down at you while you fill out this questionnaire, you may have that urge to respond the way that you So the next type of reactivity that we want to talk about is demand characteristics. And so demand characteristics is where participants respond the way they think the researcher wants them to. And this may happen if you think you know the purpose of my study and you really like me as a researcher, so you want to help me out, or you just want to be a really good student and helping the researcher out with their research. So questions seem to demand or require that people say and do things that they normally might not do. So when someone you love asks you, one question or one example that's great that gets at this type of demand characteristic is if someone you love asks, do these jeans make me look fat? The right answer is always no, and that's a joke, but that's socially acceptable or even expected of you if you are with that individual. Otherwise, you may end up like this cartoon, or your partner won't be speaking to you. And so that is a type of demand characteristic that may show up. Types of studies that we have within psychological research include observation studies. And so the types of observation studies that occur include naturalistic observation, so just unobtrusively observing individuals in their natural environment. If we just went out with a pad and a pencil and we went on library lawn, sat on a bench and just made notes about the way people acted on campus, whether they went into the library, how many people went into the library versus how many people stopped and sat on the library and lawn to study. Those are type of naturalistic observations that you may have. This is not always a viable solution, just because there are problems with this. Not all things occur naturally. Some people who, some answers can only be gathered through direct interaction. So that may be interaction with other peers, interactions just with different tasks. And so we're not always able to have this naturalistic observation of how people just behave in their natural environment. Another type is this analog observation. And so this is what is having to do with the what would you do logo on here, if you've seen that TV show. So with the analog observation, they observe people in artificial situations that they set up in order for them to record a TV show. So hidden camera shows or social psychology, they try to set up these social situations in which they can see how people will react and behave. So these type of experiments are not experiments, but observations allow us to have more control over what happens, but it may make things a little less realistic because, again, individuals are not in their natural environment, or they are not just walking around on library lawn. We have them in this fake type of artificial situation. So next we see this observer bias. And so observer bias, just as important to observational studies, is this observer bias. So the experimenter may also need to be blind in order to avoid observer bias. So this is the tendency for the experimenter to report seeing what he or she expects to see. And so if I created this drug therapy for individuals that are suffering from attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and I think it's the best new medication on market, and I go out and I collect data on all these individuals taking my medication, I may have the tendency to report what I expect to see. So I expect them to have a reduction in the number of symptoms that they're having, so they're not as hyperactive, they're not as inattentive, or I may distort the results. And so in order to combat that or to lessen that bias, what we do is we hold a double-blind study. And we have these double-blind experiments where neither the participant nor the observer or the experimenter actually knows which group the participant is in, or the participant nor the observer actually know the purpose of the study. And so the observer may be a research assistant that is helping to conduct the study, and this is used especially in medical studies with the drug therapies that I was using as an example. So the next thing that we want to talk about is measurement. And so measurement within any of our psychological research studies includes a two-step process. And so within measurement, we have what we need to do. The first step is defining our operational definitions, or more so defining what are we actually measuring. And when we look at what we're measuring, actually defining even further, what is that construct, what does it look like, how are we going to measure it is the next and the second step. So how are we actually going to measure what we want to measure? And so if we looked at defining a operational definition, or defining the construct, say I wanted to research individuals' happiness. So that is my psychological construct that I want to research. So I want to operationally define that as the number of times a person smiles, the number of times a person laughs. And so that is an operational definition. So a description of a property in measurable terms that are concrete. So smiling and the number of times of laughing. Maybe even further, so how many times they do that within 1 hour is a measurement of how happy an individual is. And so how am I actually going to measure that? So I can either do that through observation, I could do that through self-report measures, so actually have people fill out measures. And so with this, some things are really easy to define, like distance, height, weight, age, time, and temperature. But the psychological properties are more difficult to define, like happiness or love and intelligence. Although we know what these things are, to actually define them in terms of how to measure them are pretty difficult. And they make our studies even more difficult at whether we're actually measuring what we want to measure. And that leads us into talking about the validity, reliability, and power that we see within psychological studies, and these are very important to the integrity of our studies. So validities, when we look in your chapter, your book has this very specific definition. But when I think of validity, and I'll do this with validity, reliability, and power, I will have my own definition for them. And so when we think of validity, what we can think of is what you're measuring doesn't actually measure what you think it does. And so if I'm measuring happiness and I'm measuring it through the number of times a person smiles, the number of times a person laughs, is that are those two things actually measuring happiness? And if they are, then my measure is valid. So validity is shown through reliability and power. So how do we get validity? We get it through being reliable and having power. And so that's where it leads us into these two different other definitions. And so reliability, again, here's the book definition and then my definition. So reliability, can we actually replicate results over multiple trials? So this means if I take my measurement of happiness and I bring in 200 more people into the lab and I have them fill out that same measure that I had 100 college students fill out. So I want to know if it's reliable with older populations, if it's reliable with different ethnic groups, different religious groups. Can it replicate? Does it reliably produce the same results in measuring my construct of happiness? If it does, then it is reliable. And this will make a lot more sense when I pull up a picture that distinctly shows what's validity and what's reliability in a graph or an illustration. And so it'll make more sense once we go through these definitions. So one thing to think about is that it's possible for a measure to be reliable but not valid. And this is again because when we want something that's valid, it has to be reliable. But if we want something reliable, that does not mean it's valid. And so again, once we see this illustration that's coming up, it'll make a lot more sense. So the last definition that goes along with this is the term of power. And so power, the book definition is presented, and then my definition is, does your measure actually measure what it's supposed to? So am I actually tapping into the construct of happiness just by measuring the number of smiles or the number of times a person laughs? Is that really happiness? Or there are plenty of other different types of measurements that could answer that question of what is happiness, and not just smiles and the number of times that someone laughs. It could be whether they're married or whether they are actively seeking the goals that they have placed in their life, whether that's school or getting married or any other type of goal that an individual may have. Are they meeting their goals in life? So with power, what we are getting at is, does your measure actually measure what it's supposed to? And if it does, then it adds better reliability. Again, better reliability of your measure actually measuring happiness. So here is that illustration that I talked about with reliability and validity. And so here on the left, we see the illustration of the bullseye with some misfirings. And so with this one, it says it's reliable, but it's not valid. And so if we're actually hitting that target, if we're measuring what we want to, if we're supposed to measure, then we would be hitting the target. But we see that we're not, so we're not valid. But we do see that we are shooting in the same general area. And so if we're shooting in that same general area over and over again, so we're getting more results of happiness across groups, across individuals, then that is a reliable measure. So we're shooting in the same area, but we're not actually hitting that target. We're not really measuring what we want to. So again, this measure is reliable, but it's not valid. Here we have low validity and low reliability. So we're not hitting the target, but we're actually getting near there, and we're reliably hitting it because we are hitting that target around the target area. when we're not reliable and we're not valid, we're just all over the board. We're everywhere except for that target. We may get close to it, but we may get really far from it. And so we're just not reliable and we're not valid. When we have both reliability and validity, we are hitting that target straight on. We're measuring what we want to, and we are reliably hitting it every time that we're measuring happiness. We are actually measuring it. And so every time we shoot that arrow, we're shooting in the same vicinity of that target data. We have all of these individuals that participated in our study, and now we want to describe it and we want to display it. What do we actually do with that data? So once we get the data, we actually talk about two different techniques for describing data. And the first is graphic representations and descriptive statistics. And today we'll talk about graphic representations, and in the next presentation talk about descriptive statistics. So with graphic representations, we have frequency distributions. And with frequency distributions, this is a measure of how many times does a score actually occur in the data set. And so this is a frequency distribution. So if we were to say how many times does or do the people in our class, how many times can they reach level 45 of Candy Crush? And so how many people did that? Well, about 35 people got to that score. And so this is just a distribution of all of those scores of all the people that participated in our study, which included all the people in our class. And so if you look at this, this actually is reminiscent of a bell, and this is called a bell curve. So here's our bell curve, and it takes on the shape of that. And this is said to have a normal distribution, which we'll go further into detail in the next slide. So here's a different type of graphic representation that actually is almost the same as this one, but it's actually represented in a different way. And with this one, we have two normal distributions, but we're displaying two different groups. So this is men and this is women, and again, it's taking on that bell curve. And so here we talk about the normal distributions. So both of the previous graphs had normal distributions where most of the individuals they were observing or that participated in their study, they were concentrated around the middle. So if we look back, a lot of these individuals were scoring about a 45 and 55. They were scoring somewhere in this range, about 35 to 65. That's where the most of the students were scoring on Candy Crush. And so when we look at that, 50% of the individuals fall above and below the mean. So here is that graph just with more numbers, and these are actually measures of central tendency. And so if you remember back to algebra, or maybe you took AP Stat in high school, you talked about the mean, median, and mode. And so here is the mean, just the smack dab of all of those all of the participants that were in our study and all of their scores. This is right in the middle of the highest score that was recorded and the lowest score that was recorded. This is just right in the middle of our data. And so with this, we see that half of the people scored above the mean and half of the people scored below. So with this is a normal distribution. Here we have skewed distributions, and the one on the left is a negative distribution, and as we can see, the mean has shifted from the center, where it was right here, to the right. And so now the majority of the participants that were in our study are left to the mean, and so it's not equal anymore, our distribution. It's about probably 80-20, so 80% of our participants are scoring below the mean, whereas 20% are scoring above the mean. 20% are scoring above the mean. So one example of a negatively skewed distribution may be the number of people who have reached a high score or a high level on Candy Crush. I'm using Candy Crush because I play that on my phone when I'm bored. Candy Crush. So if they reach level 200 on Candy Crush, how many people actually reach that level? Well, some do, but most people may not. So only about 20% of the individuals that we surveyed or got their information from scored above a 200. Whereas on the right is the graph on the right is positively skewed distribution, and again the mean has shifted away from the center right here to the left, and the majority of people in this study are to the right of the mean. And so again, it's an 80-20 thing, 80-20 distribution, where 80% of the sample is above the mean, because here's the mean, so 80% are above the mean and 20% are below it.